C10 Talk, episode 166. Keith Seymore. He worked for General Motors for 40 years. Started off in Flint, Michigan, working on line 1 trucks, C10 Trucks.
When I graduated and I was an actual full-time employee, I was the supervisor on line 1, which was the pickup line in the fender set area. So what that means then is the area prior to me, their last operation was body drop. So that's when the cab and pickup box were set on the chassis. And that guy would tighten down the cab bolts, and then it went into my area. And in my area, we fixed the cab bolts that they cross-threaded or messed up. We tightened the pickup box down. We hung the spare tire. We installed the floor shift levers. So like the M20 manual trans with the creeper gear, my guy put that shift lever in. And then underhood wiring, and to the point where we put the front fenders on, left and right front fender. And then I had a couple of repair guys, and then it went into the next area where they set the hood on and finished it off. So I had, I want to say 36 or 37 hourly employees that reported to me. And there were probably about 26 productive operations, which included the left side, the right side, and then I had guys in the pit as well.
Damn, son. When you think air suspension for your build, you think AccuAir. Whether it's the ease of their plug-and-play installation, the E-Level touchpad, or their new Endo platform, it's better by design, and it's zero compromise for you and your truck. AccuAir. When you're looking for classic Chevy or GMC truck parts, BrothersTrucks.com is your number one source for 1947 to 87 Chevy and GMC restoration parts. Head over to BrothersTrucks.com and order your free catalog today. If you're like me and you want the best possible products for your build, Mar-K Quality Parts has you covered, from side moldings to bedwood and so much more. Mar-K.com, and follow them on Instagram too. Vintage Air. Their SureFit kits are the best value and the most completely engineered AC systems you can install in your truck. The choice is obvious. VintageAir.com.
Let me tell you what Melvin Post is packing right here. I've got 411 Posi track out back, 750 double pumper, Edelbrock intakes, scored over 30, 11-1 pop-up pistons, turbojet 390 horsepower. We're talking some bucking muscle.
What does that do? Does that blow your mind? That just happened.
Welcome to C10 Talk, your C10 Truck podcast.
And now I have a chance to be the best, maybe the best in the world.
My old man is a television repairman. Got the ultimate set of tools. I can fix it.
I said I got 50 cents in that jukebox, and all I can hear is your mouth clapping. You hear that?
Here's your host, Ronnie Welch.
What up, what up? C10 Talk, episode 166, Keith Seymore. Long time coming. And that tends to kind of be the theme for 2020, getting caught up with some of the guys that I've had on my list and making it happen. So Keith worked for GM 40 years. I knew he worked on the line, and that was from the days of the forum where Keith would, kind of express his experience and or share his knowledge. So from there, worked some angles to get him or get in contact with him through the forum. And once we finally were able to touch base, we made it happen. So I was pretty thankful to get some of Keith's time and be able to deliver that to you, because I feel, it's so important that if we can capture some of this history, capture some of this knowledge and these people's experience, we can share it and we've got it kind of documented. So again, thanks Keith for that, and hope you guys, the C10 Nation, enjoy it. It's cool to hear him talk about his assembly experience and then his progression throughout his career. Myself, eastbound and down to the Throwdown LST 2020. We are leaving tomorrow morning and getting this out today. As we get back, I'll have a whole nother episode just for LST stuff. So I definitely wanted to get this out to you guys. For those of you who are traveling to and from, we've got some eastbound and downers with some westbound and downers, some southbound and downers, and tons of folks that are working their way to LST 2020. Such a fun show, great time ahead, and the journey is always it's a story within itself. So hopefully nothing too crazy. We do have a big group of people this year, probably the largest. This is our fourth year for doing Eastbound and Down to the Throwdown, and my fifth year consecutively going. The first year I flew out, but good times ahead. We do plan on stopping by Martin Brothers, but I don't think everybody's going to be there. And then we hit this place called Deep Eddy's Vodka as well on Thursday. So Wednesday morning, we'll roll out. Again, 20-25 trucks. Follow C10 Club. John Oro does a great job of documenting. I don't think he's taking the prom queen, so he'll be behind the phone doing what he does. I'll try to share as much as I can. And we've got like 20 people going. So I imagine there's going to be about 10 to 15 trucks that are driving and making the trek. And then another handful of, people that are driving their tow trucks, if you will. I myself am going to tow the trailer with orange slice in it. And then I will pull it out probably once the first day and then hopefully the whole second day and get behind the wheel orange slice. But because we're taking the whole setup and the gear and everything, we need the trailer and have it enclosed. So that's kind of the thing there. And then it works if something happens, we can pull a truck in the trailer and drop orange slice out. Hopefully, orange slice is only coming out because I want to drive it and not because we have to. But the odds are you've got a handful of old trucks and beating the pavement. So thanks for all the support. Thanks for following us and getting jazzed up about that. Orange Slice, trying to get some stuff ready. I got a new bumper from Brothers, a new sport bumper. I was going to put that on. But because it's cut in the back, the chassis, obviously, the frame, the bumper brackets don't go in where I need them to go. So I do have some adjustment that I'll do before I go to Power Tour. Adjusted the ride tech. That was nice. I was a little really raked, and I like that, but I want to bump up the front just a scotch. So that's nice to be able to get in there and just kind of hit those collars, lock them in, and change it up a little bit. So a few things that I'm working on to get ready, make sure the truck's ready. It is nice, though, to already have a truck that's pretty much set up. Hence Yellowstone, few years where we're scrambling at the last minute up till 2-3 in the morning. This time a little different. So hopefully we'll get the truck loaded up here in a little bit and be ready to rock and roll. We do have our new shirts. They did drop. I mentioned it last episode with Jeff Martin, Muncie Speed, that I was going to have those new shirts. So those did drop and pretty popular. You guys are digging those. So thanks for the support on those. The store will be shut down. So as of today, the store will be shut down because everything's going to be loaded up. So we hate to sell something that we don't even know if we have or not because obviously we're going to LST. So when we get back next week, we'll open everything back up after we inventory, what we have left from the show. So the new shirts, I'd rather be driving my C10 or I'd rather be driving my square body. I think they turned out cool, just to the point, and people are digging them. Another thing I want to mention is the voice message ability that you have. So if you log on to c10talk.com or c10nation.com, you on the right, there's a little tab there. I do have people that leave me a few every now and then. If you leave me a comment, I play it on the show, you're getting a free shirt. It's that easy. So I want to hear your input. I want to hear your thoughts. I want to hear good, bad, ugly, how we're doing, how you're doing. If it's good and the content's out there and the audience, I think the audience is going to want to hear it, then I'm going to put you on the show and, send you a shirt. So just click that little button to the right. It says leave a message, and it goes right over to my email and plays it up. So I really like to hear back from you guys. If you get a chance and you got something to say, you want to sound off, go ahead and leave us a message. Speaking of some messages, make sure you're sharing the pod and then giving us the review. That's always a big thing, and you guys are kicking butt, but please continue to do that. Let me read off a few real quick here. I always look forward to listening to your show. 5 stars. Fireman Dad 75. Thank you, Fireman Dad 75. Hey, Ronnie, it was great to meet you in person. I'm still trying to break into the C10 world with my own C10. I've been in the market for a few years now, but it always slips through my hands. It keeps me motivated when I'm listening to your podcast. Keep up the great work. The trucks are awesome, but the people and their stories are even better. Thanks, Matt Smith. Matt Smith, Fireman Dad 75, 5 stars. Thanks for doing that, Matt.
5 stars, perfect. Thank you.
Best podcast, 5 stars by Pro55 Dude. Thanks, Dad. Pro Dad Jack. Best podcast out there. They don't get any better than Ronnie. This guy's amazing. He just keeps going like an Energizer bunny. Never stops. Great episodes. Keep up the great work. Thank you so much, Jack. Pro Dad. I love that guy. He's, hey, I get to see him tomorrow. And thanks for leaving that review, Jack.
If I start, perfect. Thank you.
Best damn podcast, 5 stars by C10. I think it's Jeffy, but Hefe, I think is what we'll say it. The white guy version and the Matador version. So C10 Hefe, thanks for the great podcast. It makes my work day fly by. Keep it up, Ronnie. Best damn podcast, 5 stars.
If I start, perfect. Thank you.
Thanks for doing that, guys. I appreciate that. I appreciate you taking the time to kind of let us know how we're doing. Remember, if you do have an iPhone and you listen on iTunes, you can just scroll down to the bottom, log on to C10 Talk, get it on your thing, and then go all the way down, and you can leave us a review. So I appreciate that. Thanks again. I hope you enjoyed Keith. I know I did. All right, guys. Late. All right. C10 Nation. All the way from Michigan, we've got Keith Seymore, and again, this 2020 stuff is a little bit a long time coming. I've been reaching out to Keith for a few years now, and really stoked to have you on. Keith, welcome to C10 Talk.
Thanks for having me.
So let's just dive in. You know, my exposure to you is from the old 67 to 72 forum, and you would kind of chime in because you had so much history with these trucks. So tell the audience a little bit about who you are and then your employment early on with GM.
All right. Well, I started at the truck plant, the Flint Assembly truck plant in June of 1979. So I'm actually a second generation GM employee. My dad worked for GM for 32 years. And then as a result of that, I was kind of predisposed, especially being in the Flint area in Michigan in the auto industry. So I signed up to go to college at GMI, General Motors Institute, which is General Motors' own college for engineers and managers. And when you do that, you have to have a sponsoring agency. And mine ended up in the truck plant. So I started there in June of 79 and worked directly at the assembly plant for probably 5 or 6 years before I transitioned into the engineering community.
It's pretty cool run there. You got to think you grew up with it, right? So you followed your dad's footsteps. And what was your dad's job? Obviously changed if you worked there for 32 years.
Yeah, he started out, he was an hourly employee and he moved into skilled trades. So he was a die maker for 26 years. And so he did a lot of cool stuff. He made, at Flint Manufacturing, which is where he worked, they made pressed metal parts. So that would be air cleaners, oil pans, valve covers, rocker arms, radiator supports, gas tanks for Chevy trucks, all of those kinds of metal products. And so he did, by being in the die room, he got to do a lot of special work. So he did the original components for the mystery motor, which became the Chevy Big Block. He did special runs of experimental parts for Zora Arca Stuntoff for Corvette work, and those kinds of things. So he did that 26 years. And as a result of his mechanical aptitude, they asked him if he wanted to become an advanced manufacturing engineer. And so he moved into the salaried ranks then and finished his career as a manufacturing engineer, had several patents on behalf of GM. He is the GM patent holder for laminated steel, which is like a noise suppressing steel. He is the GM patent holder for the hydroform process, which is used on truck frames, Corvette frames, and a couple other patents that escape me at the moment.
You said the mystery machine, and that's the first time I've ever heard the Big Block. So is that something that GM was keeping under wraps, the 454, and your dad was fortunate enough to be part of that?
That's correct. So the original Big Block was introduced for the 1965 model year. And then the versions of that prior to that, they were trying to run them in NASCAR racing and in NHRA drag racing, and keeping it under wraps. So when the first incarnation of the Chevy Big Block was referred to as the mystery motor, and so that was the first use of a porcupine style cylinder head, with displayed valve arrangement.
It's pretty cool to hear that. I never really knew that, and to think, they had an assortment of big blocks, right? The 396, the 427, but maybe, and then for trucks, we didn't get to see the 454 until 73.
Right. So you normally will hear it associated with guys like Smokey Yunick, and, that caliber of person.
So did you always kind of anticipate you'd get into engineering early on, or kind of lead us, along that line?
I did. I'm guessing I was probably around 8 years old when this course kind of became apparent to me. So, there was my dad's influence, and then when we lived in Flint, my next door neighbor, who was quite a bit older, also went to GMI, and I kind of emulated him, kind of looked up to him as a big brother that I didn't have, sort of. And so when he went to GMI, I kind of just figured I would do the same. It wasn't easy. It was a top 10 engineering school at the time. It was the kind of thing where you had to apply to get in. And in that time frame, they gave you 3 tries to get a sponsoring agent. And it took me 4 tries. So I was on the 4th try of 3, I was successful. I tried at Chevrolet Manufacturing, and they didn't. I tried Chevrolet Engineering first at the Tech Center, and they said no. And then I think I tried Buick, and they said no. And I tried manufacturing, and they suggested that I try the truck plant. And it was the truck plant that finally said yes. So it took me 4 shots out of 3 that were allowed.
I don't think that works for my ratio base, but I'll take it because it works for how life really works. And sometimes, it takes 4 tries on your 3rd try. But walk us through that. How does that work? When you say a sponsoring, in my mind, I think you almost interview for a job, and then they sponsor you, that they're going to take you once you come out. Is that how that works?
That is. So it's a cooperative arrangement. And so you work, and then you work for a time period, and then you go to school in the opposite session. And so immediately before I started, it was 6 weeks and 6 weeks. So you had one section that would work for 6 weeks, and then they would go to school for 6 weeks. And while they were in school, the other section was working. So you had A section and B section, and they switched off. By the time I started, it became a 12-week semester. So I was B section, so there were guys in school, and then we were at work, and then at the end of 12 weeks you would switch off. And the assumption was it was a 5-year program, so it was 4 years of academics, and then the 5th year you wrote a thesis, and so you were totally devoted to doing that work during your 5th year. And then the assumption was when you were done, they would offer you a position and you would accept. That was kind of how that was supposed to work. And then the other notable thing is you got paid, I guess 2 more notable things. One is that you got paid while you were working. And generally it was enough to pay for your schooling. And then most of the guys had enough left over to buy a new vehicle too. So in 1980, I bought my first new Chevy pickup, which I spec'd and then followed down the line as it was built. The other aspect is that time that you were at work counted for your GM seniority. So when I retired, I was just shy of 40 years seniority, but it started in June of 79, even though that's when I started at GMI.
Kind of like your employee number started at that point and your seniority as well.
Correct.
How old were you when you started?
17.
Wow. So you graduate, or you had, just prior to graduation, you started this process. You knew early.
Yep.
You were going to be a GM man.
Yep, that's correct. So, I graduated from high school, and I think I think I took a week off. I'm trying to remember if it was 2 weeks, and I'm pretty sure it was a week. And my dad suggested that I should take 2 weeks because it was going to be the last time in my life that I was going to have that kind of freedom. And I don't remember if I followed his direction on that or not. But at any rate, it was June 11th when I walked through the front doors at Flint Assembly.
Well, congratulations on a long career. 40 years is very admirable.
Thank you.
How was it like growing up in Flint? You know, it's such a GM, such an automotive town. Your family was in it. Your, big brother, next door neighbor, some role models for you. How was that?
Yeah, it was very much a GM town, and at that time it was very prosperous. So that would have been the early '60s, mid '60s, and on into the early '70s. And it was so GM oriented that, you know, not only did people work at GM, but their social activities were GM related. So, you know, the local hockey rink was sponsored by the Industrial Mutual Association, and when you went to work-related picnics, you know, they were held out at the local lake, and we had what was called a die maker's picnic, you know, and so all the skilled trades guys would go out there, and there were games for the kids. And I remember the prizes were pretty spectacular. So, you know, if you ran in the three-legged race, everybody got a prize, and it was a giant Tonka truck or Buddy L. You know, I probably still have a couple of those around. So it was very GM centric. And I even remember too, my best friend down the road, I asked him one time, I said, well, where does your dad work? And he said, well, he works at Turnstead. And I remember thinking, well, gee, I wonder when he's going to get a real job working for GM. But the joke was on me because Turnstead was the name of the Fisher body plant. That was what they called it. So he really did work for GM. I just didn't realize it.
That's funny. Yeah. And to think, you know, not that you're, I guess, a word of brainwash, but you're surrounded by that culture. So that was the norm for you, and both on and off duty, because on duty, you're a GM guy, dad, and then the fun, the picnics and the camaraderie, and you grew up around all these people and one big family. And like you said, a prosperous time for not only America, but GM.
Yeah, that's right. And there, even though Flint has been fairly decimated by the pullout of GM, there's still vestiges of that. So, like when you drive through Flint, you still see a lot of Buicks. You know, you still see a lot of GM influence, even though it's very much pulled out.
One of the guys I was fortunate enough, and I still talk to him every now and then, and boy, he's coming up on 103, is Paul Hitch. And I interviewed him and his son Doug, and the memories that Doug had growing up there was Woodward Avenue. Did you ever get a chance to go down to Woodward when you were a young man?
Not as a young man. My dad, he raced Pontiacs, so he raced through Royal Pontiac. And so we did spend a lot of time buzzing between Flint and Royal Oak, going down there to pick up parts or to pick up cars, that kind of thing. But as a youth, I didn't really spend a lot of time on Woodward. Our cruising, when we were messing around, we did in Flint and sort of the Flint suburbs. Now, as an adult, with the advent of the Dream Cruise, I've started attending that, and then the last several years, we participated in. It's become more than just a day. It's a week leading up, and then a couple of days after. So it's more like Woodward Dream Week now, rather than just a day. But my dad being a responsible father, he didn't really take us down and run around on Woodward. He did his racing at the track.
Okay, cool. So you go in at 17, and what did you think you were going to do, and then what did you end up actually doing? You were working on trucks. Kind of walk us through that progression, at least that first stage of your career.
Right. I think, at least for me, when I thought about engineering, I tended to think more of the styling. And I think maybe a lot of people confuse the two, and they think about, working in the studio and doing these artist renderings. And so, at least for me, I kind of thought that's where I was heading. And then as you get more in the engineering process, you realize there's this mechanical side of it, which is really where my bent is, where my family history is in the making of things and machines and tools and apparatus, is kind of where our forte is. But having said that, I knew both by starting at the truck plant and kind of in my career path that working in the assembly plant, working on the assembly line was going to be an important part of that. It was going to be a foundation, and it was going to be something that I needed to do. And so when I graduated, I chose as my first assignment to be a supervisor on the production line. And so that did a couple of things. Number one, it ticked that box that I got the assembly plant experience. But the other thing it did is it gave me a level head start on most of my buddies. So my buddies who went directly into an engineering function or plant engineering or product engineering would start out as like a fifth level. But because I started out as a supervisor on the assembly line, I started out as a sixth level. And so it gave me that little bit of a head start right out of the gate.
So what do you think about when you look back at that? You come out, you're out of college, you're out of your, GMI 83, 84, and you're working on the 84,
Yep.
84 C10, K10,
Yep.
You're working on the truck line. What was your, again, I have no idea. I feel like it's such a stage thing. Was it a chassis thing? Was it a cab thing? Was it a door thing? What did you oversee, the whole thing?
Right. So a couple of thoughts relative to that. So as I look back on my career path, everything went pretty much according to plan until we hit the nastiness in 2008. So that's when things started to go a little backwards, but not to get too far ahead. The whole career path thing that I had in mind pretty much went according to plan up to that point. So when I was a cooperative student, you worked in the different areas throughout the plant. So you might be in inspection one session, and then the next semester you might be in material or maintenance or plant engineering or any of the various disciplines. So I did do a couple of rotations where I was on the chassis line, where I was a supervisor on the chassis line, on line 2, which was Laser and Suburban. But when I graduated and I was an actual full-time employee, I was the supervisor on line 1, which was the pickup line in the fender set area. So what that means then is the area prior to me, their last operation was body drop. So that's when the cab and pickup box were set on the chassis, and that guy would tighten down the cab bolts, and then it went into my area. And in my area, we fixed the cab bolts that they cross-threaded or messed up. We tightened the pickup box down. We hung the spare tire. We installed the floor shift levers. So like the M20 manual trans with the creeper gear, my guy put that shift lever in. And then underhood wiring, and to the point where we put the front fenders on, left and right front fender. And then I had a couple of repair guys, and then it went into the next area where they set the hood on and finished it off. So I had, I want to say 36 or 37 hourly employees that reported to me. And there were probably about 26 productive operations, which included the left side, the right side, and then I had guys in the pit as well.
How long is the process for each truck? The way that you're saying it, you're doing a great job of describing it, but it seems like it's fast.
It is very fast. So the line rate at Flint Assembly was 60 an hour. So that's one completed truck every minute. So that means if you're standing on the final line, they're driving off one truck every minute. The other implications are that gives you about 45 seconds to do your job. So whether it's hanging a fender or putting a shifter in or hanging the spare tire, you've got about 45 seconds, and then you've got 15 seconds to reload, catch your breath, maybe glance at the newspaper, and then hit it again. And then having said that, that was the final line rate. And then any feeder lines, so the front end sheet metal line, where guys are working kind of off on a feeder line and then it's brought to the main line, or chassis or paint or up in the cab shop, they're a little bit faster than that 60 an hour in order to keep the pressure on and keep all the buffers filled. So that way, if you've got a breakage in the cab shop or in paint, you can continue to run the final line. It doesn't stop. And then they can work and resolve that issue and then catch back up. So while everything is sequenced, they're not totally linked in that way. In other words, the goal is to keep the final line going, even if one of those other feeder lines has a problem with either maintenance or manpower or whatever the case may be.
Sure. Now, as a supervisor, are you also in charge of overseeing kind of a quality control?
Yeah. Yes, you are. So in my case, the big thing, the mechanical aspect wasn't too bad. So, if you're hanging a spare tire, it's either on or it's off. If you're driving bolts, they're either driven home or not. So those are kind of binary. But where you had some leeway is, say, fitting the fender to the door.
Yeah, for sure.
So in that case, what we would do is we had a little magnet, and it would clip. It would clip on the show surface of the door, and then it had a little blade that would stick kind of crosscar, and the thickness of that blade is what set the fender to door gap. So you'd put two of those on. There were two guys hanging the fender. They'd swing it off the feeder line, jam it back against those little gauges, and then drive those bolts. And that's what would set that gap when you looked at it from the side. And then you also had shim packs, and that's what would set the fender in and out, so that it would either shingle over the door or be flush with the door. So I say all that to say, we didn't fit each truck individually. You kind of ran on trends. So the guy would come in the morning, he'd look, and whoever was there the night before would tape 3 shims together. And so that's what he would run. He'd run 3 shims taped together, stick them in, boom, 1 a minute. And then you do that until you got a call from the end of the final line, and it would be the main inspector or the guy at the end of the final line, and he would be hollering, what the hell is wrong with you? Are you even looking at these trucks? The fenders are sticking way out, and you better fix that before I come down there and show you how it's done, kind of thing.
Time for 2 shims.
You'd look at it. Yeah. So then you'd look at it. Typically it was a little more animated and maybe a little more colorful than that. But so then you'd look at it and you'd go, okay, well, we'll take a shim out, and then you'd tape 2 shims together, and you run that until you got another call, and gave you direction in some other way. So you kind of based your quality control in that regard on trends, not on each individual vehicle. Now, admittedly, when they got out back, if they were in a stall, or someone was looking at them as they were going down a short repair line or something, they might do some fine tuning back there. But at least on the main line, you were just trying to keep that process going.
I think, and one of the things that I had spoken to you over the years of trying to make this happen was it's so important for us to capture this history. So I'm so grateful that not only are you willing to take your time and share it with the C10 Nation and all of the listeners, and we can share this fun, this experience. It's funny now, not only how popular the trucks still are, but I think we set the factory or the line up for failure in a sense that you think, well, it has to be like it was in the factory, but now it's 40 years old. It's moved. It might have been wrecked. They're not perfect, and they weren't perfect. And so sometimes when people break them down, you're like, holy shit, this must have been a Friday truck, or something. Oh, this was a Monday truck, or whatever it is. I'm sure you've heard it all, but it's funny.
Oh, yeah.
My 73, which was the first year of the crew cab, once I took that thing apart and I saw, what a crew cab looked like with no carpet and the seams in the middle and the doors and the amount of washers I have to try to line up those crew cab doors. It's funny to see now, we think that, it's perfect from the factory. They're going through there at one a minute. They're not perfect.
That's right. And the goal really was to get them out. It wasn't to make show trucks.
Yeah.
So
that's a great, that is a great point. It wasn't to make that is a great point. I'm glad you said that, because that's how we think, right? Oh, it's a show truck. This was to get them out. We had to keep the wheels moving.
Yeah, it makes me think of a couple of things. So this 65 GTO that I mentioned was my dad's, and it's in original unrestored condition. So it's got the factory applied paint and the factory interior, and none of that has changed in the last 55 years or whatever that number is. And it's got the worst paint job I've ever seen. It's got handprints in the paint. It's got areas where it looks like someone wiped it with something and then sprayed the paint right over it. There's hairs in the paint. The carpet, doesn't fit the trim. The headliner's hanging down, and that's how we made them. That it is, it's very representative of how they were built back then.
Hey guys, I have Jim Flanders, Brothers Trucks on. Jim, what's the latest?
It's the same old thing over here. We're grinding away, selling truck parts, and really focusing on our YouTube channel.
The cool thing is, myself included, I'll check that channel out. It's a great customer service, a benefit to us. When we buy something, we can get in depth and know a little bit more and know the ins and outs, especially to watch it even before you go to install the product.
Yeah, absolutely. And we built a tech center in the back of the warehouse, so we literally bring in new products, we'll build them onto a truck or put them onto a truck, and we can see instantly how much work it's going to be, how easy it is. And we put that out to our YouTube channel so people, like you said, they'll be able to look at it and go, you know what, I can do that job in a day, or I can do that job in an hour. And it basically just completes a whole package of not just selling the product to a customer, but really backing them up when it comes to showing them how to do it and just making sure that they've got everything they need to get the truck back on the road or keep it on the road.
Like I said, I've watched it myself. I love it. Now, I heard you're rearranging some stuff over there. What's going on in the warehouse?
Yeah, we actually, this last year, we've been building a ton of inventory. And for a long time, we've always said, if you don't have it on the shelf, it's hard to sell it. People want to have it on the shelf. They want to know they can call and get it out the door that day. So, we're just trying to be more efficient. We're trying to have more inventory on hand. And, we've done a really good job at building inventory over the last 25 years. So I think that's what's putting us in the lead in this truck market for sure.
I totally agree. Brothers Trucks, you guys, for all your Chevy and GMC truck parts. And don't forget, they're putting new stuff on their YouTube channel all the time, so check it out. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you.
Marquet has been in business for over 40 years. It all started in the original owner's garage. From humble beginnings of a couple parts in a garage to a 2-building manufacturing facility making over 6,000 parts, Marquet has grown to be one of the country's premier truck parts manufacturers. They not only design the products, but also design the tooling to build the products, guaranteeing quality control. They have made their original parts from the original trucks. Aluminum strips are double polished, creating a mirror finish, and crystal clear anodized. They use the highest quality, hand-selected show quality wood that will hold up over time. Why? Because it's kiln dried to precision moisture levels specifically for Marquet. They stock oak, pine, and mini exotics, guaranteeing extremely fast delivery. All parts are manufactured in-house in Oklahoma City, USA. They offer quality parts built by Americans for old American-made trucks. So when you're looking for body moldings, bed strips, bed wood, and so much more, think Marquet. That's mar-k.com.
And that's how we made them. That it is, it's very representative of how they were built back then. And then the other thought that brings to mind is after I left the assembly line and I went into the development community, that's one of the things we did is we fluffed and puffed show trucks and trucks for executives to drive. And, these are brand new trucks. And yet I knew before I saw the truck, I knew several of the things I was going to have to do. I was going to have to fix the wind noise from the vents. I was going to have to balance the tires and wheels. I was going to have to balance the driveline. If it was a show truck, it would get sent to Milford, and they would what they called flatten the paint. So basically sand the paint with sandpaper and a tongue depressor, to knock the orange peel off. Those were all things that we knew we would have to do before we even saw the truck.
It's you knew what to do to take it that next level. So you worked for 5 years. So when did you leave assembly and go to development?
So it had to be around 85 or 86. So I was at Flint Assembly for the time I was at GMI, and then I was the production supervisor for a little more than a year. And then I had an opportunity to move into what was called they call it now a front-end load team or engineering assembly liaison type position. So it was a sort of a new concept at that time to take assembly people and put them in the engineering community to give the engineering community that assembly input way up front in the process. So prior to that, engineers did their thing, they kind of threw it over the wall, and then manufacturing put it together. So this idea of having that voice of assembly in the engineering community was a new idea back then. So that was the first step in my transition as I moved from the assembly line into the engineering community, but I was still paid by the assembly plant. And I did that for a year or so. And then one of those guys in the engineering liaison community retired. And so I took his spot. And so same job, same business card, same desk, but now instead of being paid by the assembly plant, I was being paid by the engineering community. And so that was kind of when I started the break with Flint Assembly.
How long did you do that for?
That was also a couple of years. And so at that time, so in the engineering, in the launch community, you would go from assembly plant to assembly plant, help them with the models startup, resolve assembly issues. We had what we called problem communications, or PCs. And that's when they would, the assembly community would write up their concern, and then we would address it by, adding a bolt or clip or, making whatever engineering change was necessary. So in that job, then I traveled to the various assembly plants. So going back to Flint, again, going to Oshawa, St. Louis, Janesville, Fort Wayne, Pontiac, Fremont, and then ultimately Arlington, or whatever full-size plant to help them with their startup.
That had to be a lot of fun.
It was. I'm not a huge fan of travel, but it was fun to see all the different assembly plants, to see the differences in the process, even though they were building the same product. You got pretty tight as a team because you would meet the guys in Oshawa, and then 2 weeks later you'd all be in St. Louis together, and then 2 weeks later you'd all be in Janesville together, and then naturally when you're dealing with that caliber of person, there's a lot of different personalities, very colorful personalities, and so they were a lot of fun to hang out with in the evening, when you weren't working.
So you 80 to 85, you're in the plant, then you kind of go out and you're more into the engineering development, you're setting up the shop, you're wrapping up, what would become the second gen square body. What did you guys call that second gen? Did you have a name for the square headlight trucks?
We didn't. So we really didn't. We would do, and even, in the modern era, we would do these facelifts. And so you might call it a mid-cycle enhancement. but I don't remember that verbiage being used back at that time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just I call them slope nose because they slope, but most people I think call them square headlights. Versus
they're even more square than the original square. And actually, the 73 version, when it first came out, the marketing motif was called the rounded line.
Yeah,
that was the advertising theme. So this idea of referring to them as square bodies is a more modern nomenclature than what they had in mind back then.
Isn't it funny how that whole name will take over? Somebody says a square body, you know exactly what they're talking about. A whole generation of, for me, I mean, it's the truck that somewhat defined my youth. As you cycle from, I was born in 73, and then you go for the first and second gen, or the mid-cycle enhancement of the second gen square headlight. And then right on into your, for me, junior high and high school is going to be the GMT 400. So that cycle of those trucks is pretty crazy in the evolution. Were you involved with the 88 to 98s at all?
I was, from more of a development standpoint. So by that time, probably around 86 is when I went to the Milford Proving Ground and joined the development community. So basically the way that came about is I was in St. Louis at the plant, and the word came down through my manager that they were looking for volunteers who would want to move to Arizona and work at the Desert Proving Ground out there. And we had always, growing up, we'd always vacationed out there. My dad was always talking about being out there. In fact, we'd be back here in Michigan, and it'd be 16 degrees or 28 degrees here, and he'd be reading the paper, and he'd go, "It's 82 in Phoenix today, 78 in Phoenix today," and so that made quite an impression on me. And so when I heard there was an opportunity to move out west, then I said I would do that. And they were agreeable, but they wanted me to have a little bit of development experience here first. And so as a result, I moved to the Milford Proving Ground and did development on square body trucks. So at that time, I did a lot of work on brake issues, brake pulls and leads on the V Blazer. We did a lot of driveline work on the R Suburban, but just generally kind of full vehicle development. So I did that from 86 to 90, and then in 1990 is when we moved to Mesa, to the Desert Proving Ground.
Well, whether you realize it or not, that's where I'm from. I mean, I'm sitting right here,
yes.
Right around the corner from the damn thing. I grew up, and it was such a big part of employment here in Mesa and Phoenix. Before we jump to that, for the audience, the V and the R was, I'm going to let you explain it, because what I think it is it's the 87 and, through 91 leftovers once the 88 and the GMT 400 came about. But you could probably explain it a little. I'll literally have people be like, "Do I have a special truck? I have an R10. Like, not really. It just means that it's
right. Yeah, it was just they changed the engineering community changed the nomenclature so that they could distinguish between that and the GMT 400. So the GMT 400 was going to carry that CK designation, and so they needed something. They could have chosen anything, really, and it's almost a little unfortunate that they chose the letters R and V because, typically you associate that with recreational vehicle. But yeah, an 87 R truck is exactly the same as an 86 C truck, except for the addition of TBI.
Yeah.
So, but they did that so that it wouldn't cause confusion. And I guess in hindsight, it was terrible because it caused all kinds of confusion. And you'll notice they never did that again. They kept the CK designations, for example, when they went from GMT 400 to GMT 800, but changed the model codes. So instead of having I'm trying to think how to describe this. So instead of having a GMT 400, you had a GMT 800. Instead of having a 420, which would be utility,
yeah,
you had an 820, or you had an 821, or you had an 830, which would be a Suburban. So they never did use that technique again, and I'm grateful for that. But no, it's basically the same. And thinking back to that time frame, one of the reasons they did that is they pulled ahead the TBI, the throttle body injection portion of that, because they didn't want to have a whole new vehicle in '88 with a whole new driveline and a whole new fuel system. And so they wanted to pull that little bit ahead. They pulled the powertrains ahead to try to get a little more exposure and to break up the size of that change. And so that's why TBI was introduced on the CK product on the RV in '87.
Mm-hmm. So I do think they kind of did it again, and I experience it all the time. I have an '07 Classic, which when I go to the I just tell people it's Classic is a fancy way of saying leftover, but right. I don't even order parts at '07. I don't even try to mess with that. I just say it's an '06, because an '06 and '07 are exactly the same, and really my truck is an '06. It's just a '07 Classic leftover '06, which is fine because I wanted that truck anyway, but I do experience that sometimes, and I try to stay away from that. The other thing is, what do you think, and again, I don't know, it sounds like you were still involved with a little bit, but it seemed like it took them a long time. What do you remember at the time to go all the way to 92 for the Suburbans, the crew cabs, the Blazers? Right. Why did it take them so long? Did they have that many parts left over, or what was the thought, or what do you remember?
No, it has to do with the engineering workload of changing that whole product line over. So there's so much proliferation within the CK product line, or within the full-size pickup product line. By the time you talk about pickup Blazer Suburban in half-ton, three-quarter-ton, 1-ton, in 2- and 4-wheel drive, in short wheelbase, long wheelbase, in crew cab, regular cab, with 7 different powertrains and 3 different automatic transmissions and 3 different manual transmissions, and all of the proliferation associated with that, even when you get down into all the available gear ratios and tire sizes and all of that, that the amount of manpower it takes to convert that over is huge. The CK product line, at least it may not have been in the 87, 88 time frame, but at least when I was involved later on, was bigger by itself than VW and Audi and BMW combined. It was broader in terms of the product portfolio, or in terms of production volume, than major other automakers, and so it just takes a long time to get that ship turned around, to get that converted over.
Yeah, I can see that.
In fact, we used to have meetings, so like as a brake guy, you would go to a meeting, and the passenger car guys would be there, and they'd say, well, here's our brake chart, and so we got this car, and so we got it in a sedan and a wagon, and we got this engine, and we got an automatic, and there you go. And then the next week, another passenger car group would come in, and they'd say, well, we got this, and we got this, and that, Corvette guys come in, well, we got, this, and that's it. And they'd say, how come you truck guys never bring your charts in? And we're like, well, it's kind of a lot. And they're like, oh, come on. So we'd go in and we'd say, okay, well, we got, half, three-quarter-ton, 1-ton. We got this wheelbase. We got long, short. We got Blazer Suburban pickup. We got, 2-4, boom, 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 boom. And we'd lay out all these proliferations, and they're like, you know what, you guys, you don't have to bring that in again.
Yeah.
We're good.
It's a lot. It really is a lot. It's funny to think about, the where trucks are now and how popular they are, and you were at the beginning of that. That was the beginning. Mm-hmm. If you think about, the 81 to 87 is really where they started to make these vehicles a little bit more utilitarian. The Suburbans were so popular. And here in Arizona, I mean, I don't know if there was a state that sold more Suburbans than Arizona, but when I was growing up as a kid, there was a lot of Suburbans, a lot of crew cabs. You know, you obviously had a lot of regular trucks as well. But do you think that, looking back from your just kind of, again, not being directly involved, but do they start with, I have some pictures from what we call the OBS now, the GMT 400. I have pictures of that being like, developed in I think it's 84, 85. Do they really just focus on the, single cab, short wheelbase, long wheelbase trucks, get them out because they need a new model? And then do you think that they really said, okay, now we need to make sure we have the extra cab, the crew cab, the Suburban, the Tahoe, so on and so forth? Because we're looking at 4 to 5 years before they came out with those.
Yeah, you do. You start with the pickup, and then you do variants off of that. So you might start with a 2-wheel drive regular cab pickup, maybe a long or a short, and then you start building on that as far as, okay, now let's do 4-wheel drive. Now let's do short wheelbase utility. Now let's do Suburban. And in fact, you might even recall, for the I think it was the 800, for a very brief time, we had a short wheelbase, a Tahoe 2-door, and then it didn't really last. We had it, what was it, an 810, I think, and then it didn't last very long at all, and then it became the 820 and then the 830. So even as they're developing those models, some might come and some might go.
Meaning what we would call, the nickname would be an NBS. So for the audience, a GMT 800 is going to be your 99, and they did have a 2-door for a while, and then the 4-door took over, the 4-door Tahoe. So that's why the 2-door 2-wheel drive GMT 400, whatever, is that a 410 or a 420 when you think about a Tahoe Blazer? They are very popular. There's not that many of them, and there was a lot more 4-wheel drives made at the time, and the barn doors versus not barn doors, and all the different options that were available. I could see where, and we see that now, and we'll get into your continued working for GM and occupation, but you see a lot of that where they're simplifying the chassis, where, okay, that's the extra cab with the small bed, because you have the 5 bed, and you have the 6 bed, and then you have the 8-foot bed, and you're like, well, why did they do that? Oh, they didn't want to make another chassis, so they just, they made the extra cab, and then the bed was even smaller, because we didn't have a medium bed until, I guess, the NBS trucks came, the GMT 800s. There was no medium, there was no mini bed, right? If you think about a 5.5 bed, which they said, well, we need more cab. I'm assuming. I mean, I don't want to put words in your, but that's what I've read, or rumor has it that they just started shrinking the bed because people wanted more cab.
That's right. Yeah. So for our baseline as square body guys, back then you had a regular cab and you had a crew cab, which was kind of for railroads or utility use, and then you had a short box and you had a long box, and that was it.
Yeah.
So this proliferation that we have now of short boxes and long, and extended cabs and crew cabs and all of that, is relatively new compared to our starting point.
I wonder what sold more. I assume the second phase 81 to 92 of General Motors square bodies GMCs over the 73 to 80s, just based upon the numbers. Did you ever do you have a guess?
As far as body type?
Yeah, just meaning anything from 73 to 80, that round headlight, which obviously 80 can be kind of both, but round headlight versus square headlight, I assume the square headlight probably outsold the 73 to 80 stuff.
Oh yeah. And part of that was just as you mentioned, the increase in popularity. Part of that was in the increase in being able to build them, and so the longer we went into that production run, the better we got at building them. The faster you could build them, the more you could sell. So, we had model years from 81 to 91, where you were selling a million, 1.1, 1.2 million a year.
So were you ever involved in any strike when that all, you think about all that history? I assume you were involved in different phases of that, but because you were an engineer and you weren't really an hourly employee?
I do recall a couple. We were impacted in that the plant would be shut down, but we would still have to go to work as salaried employees. And so typically that wasn't a problem. They would, if you were salaried, they'd let you through the gate, and you could go in, and basically you were hanging out in this dark plant, and so guys, it'd be dark in there, and guys would be in there maybe playing ping pong or playing cards or something, and you're just kind of hanging out and do a little bit of paperwork or something like that. So that was kind of how we as salaried folks were impacted by the strikes.
Looking back over my questions, because you came in right at the end of the round headlight phase, do you remember any of that transition going from,
I do.
the new trucks?
I do. And so what's funny about that is I have this characteristic, I guess, where it seems like when something comes out, I don't really like it. And so when I saw the 81 front end, I didn't really prefer it. And so I hurried and I ordered my 80 pickup. And so I bought an 80 short box step side 2-wheel drive, followed it down the line, as it was being built. And so that's all well and good. But then in 87, by that time I had a company vehicle. And so I had sold the 80 pickup. And right before that transition, I lost the company vehicle. They took company vehicles away from my category of employee. And so I needed something to drive. And so, I'm working at the truck plant. Part of the downside of working in an assembly plant is you want everyone that you see, or you'll go, oh, I like that, but a different color, or I like that one, but I do these wheels or this one with different mirrors, So I spec'd out, I saw the GMT 400s. I didn't like them. And so I hurried and bought an 87, which is the truck that is still in the family today. But my dad thought that was so funny. He says, you probably would have seen the 55 Chevys, not liked them, and hurried and bought a 54. Because I didn't like them when I would see them when they would first come out. But that's one of the things I do remember about the transition from 80 to 81.
I think that's normal. I think a lot of guys really tend to not love the new release. Unfortunately for GM right now, that is exactly what's happening. Mm-hmm. I've even commented on my show. I wonder looking back how I felt about, I know the 99s, I was pretty jacked up I was probably, I think I was in my early 20s. I think I was about 24, 25, and I was pretty pumped about the 99s. I really liked it. I knew that the diesel was coming. We had a lot of work at the fire department. We had some old square bodies, and we had some OBS trucks. We even had a 6.5 diesel that to this day might have 12,000 miles on it. The thing just doesn't get run that much. But I wonder how people, if you could look back and really ask them how they felt about the GMT 400. I think I was pumped about it because all I had ever known was square body trucks my whole life. So the GMT 400 to me was just like, wow, look at this truck and it's the lines. But I wonder about the guys, if they, the men at the time, the 24 to 44-year-old guys, if they were like jacked up about it. And you were probably them. You were that age and you were like, nah, I like the 87s.
Yeah. And I think you're right. I think I tend towards that. The only other data point that I have is the guy that was my office mate was the fleet coordinator for all of the pickups. And I remember he and I looking at a 400 and going, man, I don't know.
Yeah, it's. Do you feel like if you could look back, is that nerve-wracking to think like, this is my company, this is my employment, what the hell did these guys do? I don't like it, and then it ends up taking off.
No, I think because we knew it would go. I think there's more angst these days than there was back then.
Did you ever end up getting 88 to 98? Did you ever end up buying one?
Oh yeah. So I was a company vehicle driver for about 20 years. And so part of the requirement was to get the company-owned vehicle, you had to buy your own vehicle. And so you were allowed up to 4 per model year. So for 20 years, I bought between 1 and 4 new vehicles a year. And, so that hit all those model years. So I can't even imagine how many different pickup trucks I've owned.
So what does that mean? You're able to buy that many, I'm assuming at a very discounted rate. Your job is part of evaluation, critical. This thing breaks, it steers, it does this, and then you get to keep it and you get to sell it?
Sort of. So you would have a company-owned vehicle. Say I would have a company-owned vehicle that I drive to work every day that GM owns, pays the gas for, pays the insurance, so there's no out-of-pocket expense for me. But in order to do that, you have to own a vehicle. So your wife's vehicle then is a Suburban or a Tahoe or a Chevette or whatever product you choose. But you have to buy, at least at that time, you had to buy a vehicle in order to be able to drive the GM company-owned vehicle.
Now you got, assuming a smoking deal or a good employee pricing, or
Yeah. So we used to do a lot of Suburbans, and I know there was one Suburban. I want to say we got like 37% off on a new Suburban. So by the time you got the employee discount, and then a mileage discount, and then a past model year discount, and you added those all up, you got a very, very significant discount on a brand new Suburban, for example.
Cool. So tell us about Mesa. When did you come out here?
It was 1990. And so I was out there from 90 to 94. And at that time I was doing driveline development, and that was across the various full-size trucks. So that would be, it could be a CK, it could be a M&L van, could be an ST truck. So I did driveline development, and then towards the end I did brake development. So it was, I loved being out there. I loved the weather. I remember my office mate and I were standing outside one time, and he said, we're going to look back and we're going to say these were the good old days. And he's right. That was a good time out there.
Good. Yeah. That was right. The base was still open, right? So they hadn't closed the base yet.
Yep.
For the audience, GM Proving Ground for Arizona and Mesa, it was kicked out in the kind of the middle of nowhere. It's really in the middle of everything now, but it was definitely remote, and it was a treat to kind of go out to the base. So you had GM Proving Ground, and then just behind it, just south of it, you had Williams Air Force Base, and now they've converted it, to housing, and the base is ASU Polytech and an airport. So it's definitely the hustle and bustle, but it's changed a lot, since you guys were here. Mm-hmm. But it's cool. So you lived, I assume, now did you have kids at the time that lived out here with you?
We did. So we brought 2 with us, and we had a couple while we were out there. So we do have a couple Arizona natives in the family.
Cool. Whereabouts did you guys live?
We were at Val Vista and Southern. So we were in Mesa proper.
Yeah.
And kind of it'd be to the north and west a little bit of the Proving Ground. Yeah. Just to comment on how far out in the boonies it was. So when it was built in the 1950s, 55, late 50s, it was considered so far out in the boonies that when you would travel there on business, they had residences right there on property, and so you would stay right at the Proving Ground. And
Milford was they turned it into housing.
Now it's the urban sprawl is caught up with it. Yeah. Milford was the same way. So when Milford was built, it was chosen to be sort of centrally located between Flint, Lansing, Detroit, and it was considered so far out in the boonies that they had residences as well. But you were talking about Willie Field. We had a very symbiotic relationship with Williams Field, and we would even do like social functions or manager exchanges. So like one day a year, the Williams Field general would come over and he would be manager of the proving ground for a day, and the GM manager would go over to Williams Field and be manager for the day or whatever. And it was fun. It was fun to hear kind of the thoughts of both sides. And so, you know, we'd be standing on the ground and we watched these guys flying AT6s or whatever they were flying at the time and just going round and round, you know, and we'd say, look at those guys. All they do is just fly around all day. And then the word would get back that they're flying around up there looking down on us and going, look at those guys. All they do is just drive around all day.
Yeah, yeah. Again, you know, the base just flies all damn day. So the way that their runway is, it's pitched, I guess, north by northwest and south by southeast, and it just would go right over the proving ground. And for the audience, the proving ground had its own mystery motor, you know, if you could think about it, because it had these fences, and they were pretty big fences, and then they had these monstrosity of oleanders. So you could never, and it's really kind of got a mountain and then this fence and these oleanders, so you couldn't really ever see what was going on, you know, if you were just a civilian to know what's going on. You just knew that's the GM proving ground and there's rad cars. And the other thing growing up, because I was always just been so, you know, in love with Chevy trucks, is we would see a lot of the trucks that were wrapped, you know, they're kind of, because you guys would go to Payson and back through the lake and then up the hills and then down the hills. So growing up, and myself as well, I was probably, it's pretty ironic, at the time, if you were at Galveston Southern, the house I grew up in was about 4 miles to the north and 2 miles to the west. So I grew up at Gilbert McKellips. And so you would see people, you know, it's not too far from, you know, up and down Payson, and you would see those trucks all the time.
Yeah, we'd wrap them in camouflage, you know, so that you couldn't see features of what the new body style was going to be. And then, as you say, Mesa was a good jumping off point for these different engineering road trips that we would take. So we would leave from there and drive to Death Valley, you know, and go up and down Baker Grade, or we'd go to Sedona. We would go to Flagstaff or whatever and do these different engineering activities. Typically when you'd go like to Davis Dam or Death Valley, that would be powertrain cooling or HVAC work, you know, so for air conditioning and cooling and that kind of thing. And so you might see a camo truck pulling a trailer that's just got a big flat front on it, or with ballast, you know, and we would run them at a certain ballasted condition to evaluate the powertrain. One of the things that we would do in the brake group, and hopefully the statute of limitations has expired on this, but we would go to Sedona, and then from there we would go up to Jerome, and then we would do brake testing on Mingus Mountain, which is the mountain that Jerome, this ghost town, is located on. And so we would start at the top and we'd go down the backside, and it'd take us about 4 minutes to run the length of that particular state highway down the back. And then we'd go back up to the top and we'd run down the front side, and that would take about 11 minutes. And while we're doing that, we're recording deceleration rates and brake temperatures and evaluating the brake effectiveness, so pedal feel and deceleration, after you put heat in that particular setup. And so you could look at different cooling, you could look at different friction materials and evaluate those materials. Well, but I say all that to say the reason we would do these, I would call them exotic locations, you know, so Sedona or Jerome or Death Valley, was part of it was a draw to get engineering management and engineers from Michigan to come out west and participate in these activities, both so that they would get exposure to the product, but also so that we would have warm bodies to help drive the vehicles and gather this data.
I think it was an absolute hit. If you think about recruitment and the amount of people, and like you said, your exposure, and to go to Sedona, to go up to Jerome, I can only imagine, even to this day, Sedona's got to be one of the top 25, 50 destinations in the U.S. where people want to go to. So, I'm almost wondering, is that going to be considered Yarnell Hill then when you guys... Did you go? Do you recall that Yarnell Hill when you go up the backside? It's a squirrely, whirly road, man. So I wonder. Yeah, it's pretty crazy.
It might be, and that was part of the rationale. Is it's squirrely, whirly. So you're getting a lot of braking as you're going down the hill, but it's also contained.
Mm-hmm.
So there weren't any roads, for people to pull in front of you, and so we would wait at the top, and when traffic would clear, we'd give them time to get out in front of us, and then away we'd go, sort of chasing them down the hill.
Well, that definitely sounds like the good old days, and it sounds like a lot of fun to just think I get to jump in a truck today, and I get to drive to Sedona, and I'm getting paid, and I get to, I get to screw around. I mean, I get to challenge this truck and see what it's going to do. And I think the GM T400s, the brakes really do kind of suck. So if that was your zone, sorry, but
it wasn't. I'm not sure how that happened. I know the guys, and I've been confronted with that before, and I'm trying to think back, and I really don't know how that came about. But that would have been a little before my time, and then. And I don't even remember working on those specifically.
Yeah, and they've figured it out. I mean, if you take an NBS like master cylinder, and there's all kinds of changes. I will say my 07 Classic, it has 165,000 miles. It's a diesel. I've pulled a ton of shit, and I still have the factory brakes on it. And they are, and those pads are as thick as can be. So the rotors, maybe.
For me, the gold standard is the little 87 R pickup.
Yeah,
that one, the brakes are perfect in terms of the feel and the deceleration, and so that's kind of my baseline. When I'm evaluating a different brake system.
So you kind of talked about the statute of limitations. Is there anything else, when you look back over a career with GM, is there anything else that you look back and you're thinking, man, I'm really glad we did that, or I'm glad I was involved with that, or, oh my God, why did we do that?
Well, I'm sure there's both. When you think about statute of limitations, and one of the things I'm glad we did, we had... when I was at Milford, so I mentioned my office mate was the fleet coordinator for all of Full Size Truck. And he was a really funny guy. He was sort of a gentleman farmer, and so he had that dry farmer sense of humor, very charismatic, but, really just a tease, and so he'd pull your leg on stuff, or pretend to not know what was going on and that kind of thing. But we had a little white step-side pickup, and it was a small block truck originally. I want to say it was an 85 model year. And as they were horsing around just for something to do, they put a big block in it. And so since they had access to all the documentation and everything, they took the product description sheets and figured out what they needed as far as the drive shafts, and they made a rear axle that was it was a 3/4 ton center section, and drilled it for the right bolt circle, 5-hole 5-inch, and put the center bearing in, and put a turbo 400 in it and everything. And so they converted it to a big block driveline, and they ran around with that for a little while, and then they wanted a little more. So they found a better big block and put that in. And I know they stepped up through LS5, and then they had an LS6 in it. And then they bought an LS7 over the counter and put that in it. And long about that time, so I guess I should say, they go to the parts counter and they have a part number, and you give the guy the parts tag, and in some period of time, he's handing you these components. So you can imagine, what you would do if you were in that situation. So John found out that there was an aluminum 454 in the warehouse. And this aluminum 454 was the backup motor when they introduced the ZL1 Corvettes and Camaros on Black Lake back in '69. So they had cars on display that the press drove, and then they had this motor on display, both as a display piece, but also as a backup motor in case something happened to one of the ones in the car. So he figured out this guy who had it, who owned it, who had the storage tag for it. And so he starts hammering this guy to get this motor, and the guy wouldn't give it up. He wouldn't trade him. And it went on for quite some time until finally this guy that had it, he needed to go up north and he needed to pull his snowmobiles. And so he came to John and he wanted to borrow a Suburban for the weekend so he could take his snowmobiles up north. And so John traded him a Suburban for this aluminum 454. And so they put that in the pickup. And before long, I remember, I think the best pass in that setup was the 1071 at whatever the corresponding mile an hour was. So it had aluminum 454. They'd made their own cooling system. They had a fuel tank in the back, like a Blazer fuel tank in the back, moved the battery to the back, had these great big drag slicks on it on centerline aluminum wheels. And they were getting their fuel from the fuel test labs. They used something called Indoline Clear, which was this high octane fuel that they had. And so we would take it and we'd take it to local drag strips and do let the technicians that had worked on it, let them make a pass, or we might take it to a Super Chevy event and run it at a Super Chevy event. And so that was a lot of fun. It made the news, and while that was cool, that actually was sort of the beginning of the end, because our boss had been turning a blind eye to this whole time. Sure. And as it began to get more exposure, he was not happy about it. And so I came in one Monday, and John was visibly upset, and I asked him what the trouble was, and he said, well, he says, step into my office, which is funny because his office was my office. But what he meant was he had a truck sitting out in the parking lot that he always drove. He always drove a crew cab dually, red with the white stripe in the center, diesel, and he had this set of Alcoa aluminum wheels, and he'd switch those, every time he got a new truck, he'd put them on there. And so we always called it the Queen, meaning the Queen Mary, because it was so big, or because it was the queen of the fleet. So what he was really saying was, step into the Queen. So we went out and he described what happened. And he said, when that article hit, he said his boss called him in and he said, and I quote, he said, this truck has notoriety far beyond what you think or imagine. I want it gone, and I want it gone now. And so John knew that our boss was not in any mood to be negotiated with, and so he kind of let it sit over the weekend. And then that next Monday, he went back in and he said, it's broke. It had broken rocker arm stud. And he said, since this engine is actually a historic piece, would you mind if we fixed it first and then put it away, took the engine out and put it away as a functioning unit rather than putting it away broke? And Jim said, well, I guess that would be all right. So John limped it through the gate, loaded it on his trailer, took it home, stripped all the stuff off of it, brought the Hulk back in. And so when they scrapped it, it was the frame, the cab, and the pickup box.
He knew that you better get that motor out of there. I wonder whatever happened to that motor. I was talking to somebody.
Well, it's
and
funny.
Did they make a lot of those aluminum 454s?
They made because they were actually 427s. So the ZL1 was a 427 motor. So this was one or very few that were a 454 cubic inch displacement.
Yeah.
And so I asked him both, not long after that, and then again here recently, I asked him, John, where is that motor? And, so he does the coy, I don't know. I have no idea what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And so I pushed him and he said, well, I said, is it safe? And he said, yes, it is safe. And so that's all I know.
Isn't it ironic too now if you could go back and not only how much fun for you and John, and unfortunately for Jim, he probably had fun too, but if they would have known, a little bit more of now what they knew then, or however you want to look at that, in the perspective that the sport and the performance and the notoriety would probably have helped GM, but maybe they just felt like the way that you guys were going about it, or John was going about it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the popularity
it was definitely not a sanctioned activity.
Yeah. It didn't run through the right channels. I could see that. So It does seem to, when I've been fortunate enough to interview a few of the GM folks, there's plenty of channels that has to run through. I can only imagine that that's the norm for you since you grew up in it, and you dealt with that your whole career. The meetings, the channels. When you look back at your career, what do you think of? It sounds like you were a fortunate man and worked for an amazing company in the heyday. Hey guys, have you heard about the most revolutionary advancement in automotive air management? Endo by AccuAir. AccuAir's heritage of innovation was built on trucks, being the builder's choice for over 15 years. AccuAir's latest invention is the Endo platform, a modular, bolted construction aluminum air tank with the stealthiest mounting system. Endo provides a leak-free tank. Leak-free. Hello, who doesn't love that? With options for built-in valve manifolds and internal compressor solutions. That's right, the compressor is on the inside of the tank. Being on the inside of the tank means it's quiet. I'm talking library quiet, people. Head to endo.accuair.com to learn more about the Zero Compromise Air Management Package. endo.accuair.com. So you bought a C10, and it either had AC at one time or it wasn't even an option. Well, Vintage Air has the solution for you. Their sure-fit kits are designed to place the evaporator and hoses behind the dash for a factory clean look. In most cases, the sure-fit systems will be controlled by your stock dash controls using their exclusive cable converters. In some applications, a new factory look control panel is included with the kit. The sure-fit systems provide full OEM-style operations, including air conditioning, floor or vent heating, and a powerful defroster. To retain a true factory look, the AC air exits through the factory dash louvers, if originally equipped in your truck. The Gen 4 kit provides infinite, just right temperature, air blending, and blower fan speed adjustments. The Vintage Air SureFit kits are the best value and the most completely engineered air conditioning system you can install in your C10. Add the fact that Vintage Air has been the most respected name in performance aftermarket climate control systems for 40 years. 40 years? Damn, son. The choice is obvious. VintageAir.com. When you look back at your career, what do you think of? It sounds like you were a fortunate man and worked for an amazing company in the heyday.
Yeah, I'm pleased. So we're only about halfway, but when I look back on the products I worked on, they're very visible. And then even, my final project at GM was very, very unique. But as I look back, I feel like I was really restricted, so you're either curtailing yourself or you're curtailed by the organization where I didn't feel like I could really cut loose. So now at where I'm at in my life now, both in my hobbies and, I mentioned I've gone back to work for another major manufacturer. I feel like I'm more comfortable cutting loose, and throwing out crazy ideas or making crazy things happening and then apologizing later. Or, some of the projects I'm working on now are more like vehicle graphics and special edition packages and stuff, where the design community hasn't really been paying much attention. So I'm kind of doing these styling design things on my own. And then usually once they see what I've done, they're like, well, we can't have that. We can't have an engineer doing that. And so then they'll come back with input and refinements, which I'll incorporate and then go on. But I don't know. I just feel like I'm almost now, it's like I'm finally getting the hang of it.
I think too, you have to look back and, not be too hard on yourself, because you have a family, you have to keep your job. So you have to stay within the lines. And then we get older and we're like, screw that. What do I care now that I know what I know? And then you look back and you're like, man, I always liked John. He got away with all that crap.
Well, he didn't, but that's a different story.
Somebody else might have.
I think that's a really good observation. Is back then, you are working, you have a family, and you need a job. And then now, I'm an old retired guy, so to speak, and I'm working, but I'm kind of doing it for fun and just kind of, fill in until I start taking my pension. And so if it does go off the rails, it's like, well, you know what? I can probably be working somewhere else tomorrow. And so, and even to put that in the context of, I'd mentioned I'd worked 40 years. And when I did finally retire, I was like, man, why didn't I do this 10 years ago? It just was so liberating to be no longer tied to GM and to have the pension and the IRA and everything is all taken care of, and it's tucked away. Whereas when you're working, you're still in that phase of accumulating, and there's uncertainty on what the numbers are going to be and all of that kind of stuff. So it was actually very, very liberating to be done. Even though, I felt like I was still hitting it pretty well.
Yeah. I think it's always like you said, it's that uncertainty, and you've got the job, you keep it, you keep grinding, and it's the norm. And then now that you've looked back, it's a lot, hindsight's 20/20, if you could do it, you would. And if you didn't, and that's the journey that we all live. What other, you kind of alluded to it a little bit, but we got you up to like mid 90s. You worked for another 15 years. What's some other things that you were involved with?
Well, so, when I left the desert, so that would have been January 2nd of 1994, was my first day back in Michigan after leaving Arizona.
How did they get you back? Because I feel like that'd be kind of hard to get you to get out of here.
It was, but it was a career thing, so career advancement. And so I came back as a design release engineer on the GMT 800 program. And that gives you kind of an idea of how long these things take. So January 2nd, 1994 was my first day on the GMT 800 program, which was a 1999 model year, right? So, and I came back in the chassis powertrain group, and I was the engine air induction design release engineer. So I did the air cleaner and the associated ductwork and noise attenuators that were used on the GMT 800, and most of which is still in use today.
I don't know that if it relates, but I took my air box out of my GMT 800, and I wish I would have never done that. And I've tried to get it a stock one again. I just never have. I mean, I have like a K&N or one of those other brands, but those the rumors out quite that those stock ones are the way to go. So you guys did a good job on that.
Well, thank you. And I have to agree. So when we were doing that, there are a few things going on. So you might recall the previous version was a radial element that was mounted on the fender, up on the middle of the fender.
I have one.
So when we came out with the GMT 800, it was also a new powertrain. So here again, it's a new platform, new architecture, new engine, which means they weren't really readily available when we were doing our testing. But when I got the restriction specifications that I had to meet, so it was like 1 inch of mercury at this certain airflow rate at ambient to the intake valve originally. And when I looked at those numbers, I'm like, well, there's no way. And the first problem was I don't control from the throttle body to the intake valve. So I went back to powertrain and I said, that's on you. I'll sign up for 1 inch of mercury at max flow from ambient inlet to the throttle body inlet. And we agreed on that. And then as I continued to work on that, I realized that flow restriction was so aggressive that I wasn't going to be able to meet that with that current architecture. There would be too many turns. And so I realized I needed that front corner of the engine compartment, but that's where the battery was. So I began negotiating with the battery guy, and of course, he's always been there, so he doesn't want to move. And it kind of languished until finally the chief engineer called us in to have kind of a come to Jesus meeting, and we're going to hammer this thing out. Well, the beauty of doing an air induction system like that is you can actually make the parts ahead of time. You can make these prototype parts either by 3D printing, or back then we vacuum formed the ductwork and cobbled it up, and we could actually get flow numbers. And so we went into this meeting and kind of described that we were at an impasse. And so he said, Bob, what's your deal with the battery? And Bob's like, well, it's always been up here in the front. That's where the structure is. And so that's just the way it is. And so he's like, okay, Seymore, what do you got? So I went through then, and I've got data that shows, here's what the flow restriction is if you're here, and here's what it is here, and here's what's one bend, and da-da-da-da, and so I did my pitch, and we kind of sat there, and chief engineer says, Seymore, you get the front corner, Charlie, find another spot for your battery. And that was it. So I got what I wanted as far as that location, which allowed me to come in through the fender. So that gave me some protection from water and snow and that kind of thing. And then it's a straight shot, and then you make one turn into the throttle body, and that's it. And so not only was I able to meet those flow requirements, but I was able to meet them on the highest flow engines. So at that time, we didn't have the LB7 diesel yet. They had the L18 Mark engine, which was 272 grams per second. So the flow requirement was 1 inch of mercury restriction at 272. But what that means then is, since I made it for the Mark engine, I overachieved for the 3 small block engines and the V6. And so I think that's why you see that you don't really get much improvement with the K&N type setup, is because the system was already overcapacitized for the majority of the powertrains that you're putting it on.
You need like a little plaque, like you're the corner guy, you're the front right corner guy.
Yeah.
You change that. One of the things I like to say out of admiration, it might not sound like it, but I say, suck it, Solomon. This guy Solomon. Well, you're the guy that changed it. You're the guy that made it so you could get that suck out of it and that motor, and that's pretty crazy to think that, because like you said, those guys didn't want to change that battery.
Yeah, I have a couple additional thoughts, and one is, so you're the air induction guy and you're trying to meet your flow restriction. Well, the exhaust guy is trying to do the same thing. So what he'll do is he'll open it up, and then he's free flowing, and the induction guy's the cork. And so what you end up doing then is you make another tweak so that you're not the cork, and so that the exhaust guy is. And so it keeps trading back and forth until you reach some kind of equilibrium. And then the other thing was, even when we did that, we weren't out of the woods yet, because now what Bob wanted to do is move his battery all the way back to the firewall so that he's back on the structure. He doesn't want his battery on top of the wheel opening, the wheelhouse. He wants to be back on the front of dash so that he's got structure again, but that's where the coolant bottle is. And you can't not evac and fill the coolant bottle when the fender is off because you've got to have it hanging on something. So we were at kind of an impasse because the assembly plant then doesn't want to change their assembly process because they have these monuments built, and it would be super expensive to change it in 7 assembly plants to move where you evac and fill the coolant system or the air conditioning system or whatever the case may be. So we devised a scheme where we put these 2 little buttons on the back of the radiator support, and you would install the coolant model, hang it on the radiator support to stage it while you evac and fill. And then when the fender gets put on, then you moved the coolant bottle to the top of the fender where it would stay for the remainder of the life of the vehicle. And then, put the air cleaner in after that. So if you've noticed on your truck, you might notice there's these 2 little heads on the back of the radiator support. That's what those are for.
That's just a staging, really, right?
Yep.
Wow.
Yep. So then the question becomes, do you take them off or do you leave them on? And in the end, we decided, well, we'll just leave them on because we don't want to pay the labor to remove those or to fool around with them. So they just go along for the ride.
Now I'll know. That'll always be the Seymore staging.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, that's. I'm sure there's thousands of those type of stories over your career to think like why something was made the way that it was, or even when Paul talked about the Blazer, how they had worked on creating a mini Blazer to match the Bronco, and then they leave a meeting. They're like, we can't do it. Just make it look like the C10s. We've got we've already got all the molds or the tooling. So boom, and it's crazy. You look back and you're like, well, I'm glad you picked that one. I'm glad you did it that way.
It's like we talked before with all the proliferation, and so you might have a frame rail, but it's got to have all the ability to hold all the content that might ever appear in that configuration, or you might have something else where you're like, why in the world did they do it that way? Well, it's because they had some constraint, some engineering constraint or durability or manufacturing constraint at the time, and that was their clever way out of it. But 40 years after the fact, it's not obvious to us.
Well, and the emissions now that's what we see now. So for you,
right.
The amount of emissions and the things that go on in the air and we see so much of that now where you look at a truck
I would say probably the 2 major things would be emissions and barrier performance. So you recall in the old days, between 55 and 56 and 57 and 8, 9 and 61, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, there were all different, new every year. Well, now it takes us 4 or 5 years to do a new front end because of all those barrier performance. There's an aspect relative to occupant safety there. There's all the airbag sensors. There's, the amount of collapse and the way it responds and the way when we did the 03 front end refresh, we had a terrible time because that new front bumper is longer and it didn't want to accordion. It wanted to roll up, and that wreaked havoc on the sensors. So we did quite a bit of development to try to get that front end to behave properly in a barrier event. But it just shows the amount of effort that goes into these aspects that nobody sees, but that adds time and expense to the development process.
They may not see it, but hopefully people realize, and I have beat this to death, getting hired in the mid to late 90s in the fire service, the cars were still, predominantly you had 80s and early 90s cars that were wrecking. So we didn't have airbags. And in my career, over 25 years, it's amazing to me, the carnage that I can go on and watch people walk away that 25 years ago, I would roll up on somebody and be like, all right, we're going to be cutting somebody out of this car and we'll be lucky if they're alive, and now they're on the corner texting their mommy
that they're okay. Yeah, we do see that. We get letters, and so we'll get letter from a dad that says, my daughter crashed her cobalt or whatever, and we were whatever, and she walked away, and we're so thankful. So those are the good letters that you want to get.
So after you worked on the 800, what'd you end up doing?
So after that brief stint in the design release community, I moved into product integration. So there's a couple different ways to do your organizations. And when we were on the 800, we had the chief engineer, and then everybody reported to that chief, and they were all in the same building. So it was very hierarchical in that respect. But there's another way to do an organization. It's called a matrix organization. And so in that case, you do have a chief engineer who has some staff on the vertical axis, and then on the horizontal axis, you have all the tire experts and all the interior guys and all the chassis guys and the fuel system guys and powertrain. And so you have powertrain people that are doing all these various programs. So what I did then is I went to full-size truck integration, and I did the Denali program and the Escalade. So the 01 Denali and the 02 Escalade. And so I reported up to the chief engineer, and then all the design community then, they worked for their own different bosses, but it's like they're contracted out on our program, so to speak. So I did the Denali, the Cadillac, and then in 03 I did the pickup refresh, and then went to GMT 900 SUVs, and then I did a brief stint on the Hummer program. I wrote the original program plan.
Were you
for what
doing
the
airflow,
Hummer H2.
or what were you doing?
No, it was total vehicle program management. So, I was calling the guys and making sure they were hitting their dates for having the development done, or having, if there were disputes in the design community, we would go in and mediate those, that kind of thing. So it was a very high level program activity specific to that product.
So many turning wheels. So many.
Yeah.
A lot more positions than I think we think.
Yeah, and the funny thing, oh my goodness, there are so many positions. You'll meet somebody, or you'll look at an org chart, and you're like, what do these people do? I had no idea that this whole branch of the organization, even existed. But the other funny thing about these organizational structures is they come and go. So for a while there, then the chief engineer platform organization is the way to go. And then, you'll flip and you'll do the matrix organization, and then you'll get a change in management, and then they'll have this new idea of going back to what you had before, So it's kind of funny to watch the what's in vogue come and go.
Yeah, the cycle. Did you ever have a guy,
Yep.
A coworker, and you're at a picnic, you're at a, whatever it was, a recreational activity, somewhat away from your, org chart, and you guys find out that you're on the same project?
Oh yeah. So I did the Hummer program, and then from the Hummer I went to the Volt program. So, and they even did a newspaper article about this guy that went from this, giant, not very ecological vehicle, to the car that's going to save GM, so the Volt. But that's one of the things I remember on the Volt program is I would see engineering vehicles running around, or M-plate vehicles, and I'd look and I'm like, why don't I know that guy? Why is he driving my car? So I had program responsibility. I knew all the vehicles, and I knew it was vehicle number such and such, and I'm like, why don't I know that guy? So that was a funny experience.
Did you work on, when you say the Hummer, was that the H1 or the H2 style?
The H2.
Yeah.
So I was working on the GMT 900 SUVs, and I got a call from the chief engineer one Friday afternoon, and he said, you can't tell anybody this, but we are going to form a relationship with AM General, and we're going to create our own product. There is a road trip next week in Kentucky and I want you to be on it. And so I spent the weekend making travel arrangements to get to Kentucky Monday morning. And so we met in the woods, and there was AM General Management, so the owner and chief engineer and different representatives. And then we had GM truck guys there. And so they had H1s and Humvees. And we had a sort of a smattering of our off-road vehicles. So we had high-wider S trucks, and we had short box pickups that we jacked up and that kind of stuff. And we spent the week driving around in the woods. And, so we'd go down this cliff, and then when we were feeling pretty cocky, and when we got to the bottom, the guy in the Hummer would go up the same cliff we just went down, that kind of thing. So in the end, they were pretty impressed, and we were very impressed. But I knew when I got back to the office, I said, I know Terry is going to want me to write this up. And so I sat down and I used what we called the EPN, Engineering Program Number process. So that was how we defined what this program was going to be. And it's by the different UPC groups, so body, chassis, tire, wheel, powertrain, whatever. And so I sat down and I wrote it up. I said, this is going to be a segment-leading off-road vehicle with a flat windshield and big tires pushed out to the corners and 7 vertical bars in the grill and SMC flip front end and I don't know what all, roll bar. One of the things I remember I put in there is I said it should have central tire inflation system or the appearance thereof, meaning I was picturing a hubcap with a little, bar on it that would go around. And that was one of the things they said, no, we don't want to do that because we don't want to imply this vehicle has capability that it doesn't really have. Well, when it came out, guess what it had? It had the little hubcap thing. So anyway, so I wrote that up, turned it in that Monday, and that was what became the Hummer H2. So at the time, it was called Project Maria, which was the funny thing about these AM General guys is they had all the cloak and dagger stuff going on, and so they had the secret code names and everything. But Maria comes from Maria Shriver, who was married to Arnold Schwarzenegger, who was a very huge proponent of, he was driving H1s at the time. So that's where the name came from. Project Maria became the H2. And so I was there for the inception of that, and then I went back and did utility stuff. And then when we sold Hummer, or when we shut it down, Hummer and Pontiac, I came back and I was the guy that turned the lights off after we were all done. So I was there at the very beginning, missed the whole middle, and then there at the very end.
So I believe that's a Suburban chassis, correct?
It technically it's a Tahoe wheelbase, but it's it'd be like a 3/4 ton Tahoe is really what it ended up being.
Okay. I have to tell you this, how ironic. In my street, 2 houses down, 2 houses across and down, an H2, a yellow one, and then 4 houses down the other way, the same yellow H2. I literally thought that these 2 guys were the same one, and then one day and they're older guys. They're probably both. I'm going to guesstimate they're both 65 to 74 years old. They both have yellow H2s, and one of them has a Volt.
Okay.
He has a H2 and a Volt. That's his 2 cars. I'm
Good
like,
man.
I'm all, isn't that a contraindication of what you're trying to do?
Yeah. Doesn't one cancel the other?
Yeah, no, he doesn't. Yeah. And I've lived in this neighborhood for 5 years, and the same guy, and he's probably one of the smartest guys I've ever met in my life. And he's got his Volt, and then he's got his H2, and I'm like, all right, dude, whatever. But do you? I hope I'm not picking on you on this, as it just happens to be what it was. Can you recall a vehicle that was ever more popular and not popular? The pendulum swing on an H2 is to me got to be one of the biggest ever in my lifetime.
Yeah, I think you're right. Nothing comes to mind. And we had no idea about the whole like wrapper thing. and celebrities, and the way they embraced the H2 and also the Escalade, we did not see that coming. We had no idea. Totally took us by surprise in that regard, and almost unfortunate in the case of the H2, because it was a very capable off-road vehicle. It was segment leading, in terms of ground clearance and big tires and locking differential and locking transfer case, so it was super, super capable from an off-road standpoint. So it was almost detrimental, to have all these blinged out H2s. But we didn't expect that. The marketing guy would come in, the Cadillac marketing guy would come in, and he'd say, well, so-and-so's getting their Escalade this week. And then the next week he'd come in and say, well, so-and-so's getting their Escalade. And then he'd come in and he'd say, the Shah of Iran is getting 10. He's getting one in each color for each of his wives, And then I remember one time he came in and he says, well, B.B. King is getting his this week. He's getting a black one. And I said, oh, is Eric Clapton going to drive him around in it then? And they looked at me like, Seymore, what are you talking about? But I thought it was one of the funnier things I came up with. But yeah, we did not expect that.
Yeah, it's crazy, the rise and fall of the H2, and obviously the economy had a big, detrimental effect to that. But even around here in Phoenix, realtors were driving their customers around, and it was, then you'd see the H2 limos, and they were, yeah. I mean, I still see a ton of, I call them the Escadenali. That's eastbound and down. He said that one time, but the Escalades and the Denali's and the high-end HUV or SUVs, they still do really well out here in the desert. But yeah, the H2, kind of crazy. And then the H3, wasn't that around for like 2 years maybe in production?
Yeah, not very long. Not very long.
Okay. So then okay, go ahead.
The other funny thing about the H2 is, there's this discussion now about bringing Hummer back as an electric vehicle, which was it's not a new thought. So when we were trying to sell Hummer, there were three entities that were bidding on it. So one of them was like a bunch of investors that had gotten together, and then I think there were a couple of other individuals, and it didn't work out. And so in the 11th hour and 59th minute, we had this bidder that came in at the last minute, and that was his pitch, is that he wanted to make it an electric vehicle. And that one didn't work out either. But we kind of guessed, it's speculation on our part, but we thought maybe it was Neil Young, because at that time he owned Lionel Trains, and he was doing electric conversions on other vehicles. Like he had a Lincoln that he had converted. And so I have no idea if that's accurate or not, but that's at least what we were thinking at the time, is that it sounded like it was Neil Young that was trying to swoop in. And then in the end, it didn't happen.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be interesting to see what comes back and what doesn't, and whether or not electric. That's the next phase. I mean, you obviously know that the E10 the guys made at SEMA this year was pretty popular, had a lot of buzz going, and you've seen a lot. You take us up to really 08. I mean, that had to be a big, that was GM too big to fail, right? And then government motors.
Yeah, those were dark days. It really hit home for me when they quit cutting the grass, as I knew we were in trouble. And in fact, I was getting ready to bring my tractor in one day and cut the grass at the tech center on some of the areas where it was really growing up. But I knew it was bad. I guess I didn't. I was hoping for the best. I was shutting Hummer down, and so I knew that something had to happen. And then that's when this opportunity with the Volt came up. And so it was the same type of position. It was engineering program management. It was going to be the car that was going to save GM. And so I was certainly pleased to get that opportunity. It was a great team. The chief engineer on the program was the guy that did the EV1. the assistant that worked under him that I worked directly for was a great guy administratively and technically, and was really the one that I think made it happen as far as getting the thing off the ground.
Do most people have as many career shifts because I don't want to, shifts almost sounds negative, but you've moved around and it's so rad. Mm-hmm. I think it takes a guy like me who's, I'm bouncing off the walls from one thing, and I look at my son and I tell my wife, I'm like, I don't think he's going to have, he's going to have 40 jobs in his life because he's always changing things up. You kept it fun. You kept the movement. Is that normal for a company like that, or is that just you? I
think it's pretty normal. I probably moved every 3 to 5 years, and in a way that there's kind of a downside there because typically you don't get to be there right at the first, so you're coming in after kind of the foundation is laid, and most of the time you don't get to be there right at the end because you've already moved on to what is next. So it's a little bit negative in that regard, but you're right, it does keep it fresh. I think many of the people that are kind of doing what I'm doing are the same. They're kind of in and out every 3-5 years. But within that, there are experts, subject matter experts that have been doing the same thing for 20 years, 25 years, 30 years. And in a way, I kind of missed that. By being in the development community for so long, I felt a little stunted as a design release engineer. And then by moving around in the design community, so chassis, powertrain, brakes, exterior, I've done everything except interior and electrical. So I didn't really have expertise in any of those areas, but I do have very broad understanding of all of these processes. So, you make your choices and you play the game, is kind of what it comes down to. But I'm pleased with the way it worked out.
Do you ever have a position that you didn't take? You were courted for it, and you're like, I just don't have a feeling, and you look back and you're like, God, why did I not take that spot?
Well, yeah, maybe. So I always kind of stayed at the worker bee level. I didn't really want to rise through the ranks, through management and have a lot of employees reporting to me. I kind of enjoyed the autonomy of just taking care of myself. I liked to have that flexibility as far as being here for my family, for supporting my own hobby activities, racing and restoring stuff. But I think it's made me vulnerable, so in 2008 when the nastiness hit, and people started losing benefits, so losing company vehicles and getting knocked down a notch and that kind of stuff, that was me. And I kind of put myself in that position with the choices I had made early on. So on the one hand, I probably could have had a more lucrative career if I had risen through the ranks when that was offered. On the other hand, I did enjoy just being a working guy, at that first line of defense, and had to take my hits.
But I mean, I assume that you could have been just as vulnerable by moving up, and they have to trim the fat. So the higher you go, they have to cut those guys too.
Yeah, for this last round, historically, that was not the case. So in GM, and my father's GM, as you rose through the ranks, you never went backwards, and you never had to worry about being blown away. The 2008 episode was really the first time that I had ever been exposed to anybody getting knocked down a notch. And then this last round in a year ago, February, is really when the first time I've ever seen them chopping at the high levels in what seemed like a very arbitrary fashion. So I saw people get cut a year ago, and I thought, how are they going to build a car without that guy?
Mm-hmm. So in 2008, you stayed there, but did you get bumped down?
I did. So I lost a level. So I went from 8th level to 7th level, and I lost the company vehicle.
And you started almost at a 6? Is that what you were saying back when you went into supervisor role on the plant? So
Yep. So 6, and then 7 and 8 came pretty fast. So 8 is the big jump where you get the company vehicle.
Mm-hmm.
So I was 8th level for about 20 years. And then the unthinkable happened in '08, and I got knocked down to 7th, lost the company vehicle. And so that kind of brings us back to the 87 pickup that I mentioned. So in 87, when I lost the company vehicle, I ordered this little red pickup, V6, manual, overdrive, 373 rear axle, air conditioning, and that's what I drove. I drove that for about 4 years until I got the company vehicle in 91. Well, and then when I drove that 4 years, and then I sold it to my father-in-law. So he had it 18 years, and then he passed away. And then in '08, I lost the company vehicle, and so I needed something to drive. So I was kind of giving it some thought, and about that time, my mother-in-law called and said, well, would you like your red truck back? And I thought, oh, man, I don't know, because it looked pretty beat, and I wasn't sure about, how durable it was going to be. And then the more I thought about it, I thought, well, that would be cool to drive a vintage pickup and have that be my daily driver. So I said yes. And so we flew out. It was in Montana. They had it in Arizona and Montana. And flew out. We drove it back, and it never missed a beat, and it never did after that either. So that year, in May, I did the cosmetics on it. So from May to September, I redid the cosmetics. The mechanicals were fine. And that ended up being my daily driver from then on. So it's bombing around in this little red 87 pickup.
And where is it at now?
So I drove it, and actually during the Volt program, I had a short-term company vehicle. So for about a 4-year period, I was driving Volts and right-hand drive Volts and Amperas and different variants of the Volt program. So I drove the pickup through the summer, didn't really drive it in the winter. And I drove it until, I want to say about 2 years ago, and I had an opportunity to buy a 2500 HD Duramax, which is an '04. And so I jumped on that, sold the red truck to my brother-in-law, and so he's got it tucked away in his garage a couple miles away.
Well, I mean, the damn thing's been in the family for, 35 years.
Since new.
Yeah, yep. So now that thing is, once the truck makes it that long, it hopefully never leaves the family. You know what I mean?
Yeah, he doesn't have children, and so he's alluded that it will eventually find its way back.
Yeah. Now, how old are your kids now?
They range from, I got the youngest will be 21 in a couple of days, and my oldest is 30.
Now, do they have a GM? Do they kind of follow the footsteps of Dad or anybody in that?
No, none of them work for GM. My oldest is a pilot for Delta, and then I've got one that's works for the local court. One's a speech therapist, and then the others are in sales and marketing. But none.
Do you think it was hard, as much as you guys moved, or were you able to kind of stay up there once you got back there from Arizona?
Once I got back from Arizona, even though the jobs changed, everything happens here in Southeast Michigan.
Okay.
So we have moved a couple of times here locally, just within the Metro Detroit area, but it didn't really impact them as far as where their schools were. It didn't really impact where I was reporting at the time. So we have moved, quite a few times during our married life, but I don't think it didn't really wipe them out.
So when you finally did retire, how long did you stay retired before you started working again?
I was off for 3 months. So I was retired for 3 months.
That's crazy.
And really, yeah, it's primarily driven by the desire to not touch the pension or anything for a few years. Cause I'm 58 now. So I've got some good years left, I hope.
Well, and you have to pay for medical. That's, I'm assuming, right? So if you retire too young, you have to, maybe you got that included.
I did get a GM. There are GM retiree medical benefits, so that helps. That's directionally correct.
Well, and that's the big thing. I was actually talking to my in-laws about that last night. I'm like, he retired at like 65, and then he was saying that my father-in-law was saying that his brother-in-law decided to retire, and the wife didn't qualify yet, so they had to foot the bill for that for a couple of years, and that's a big thing. And for me, it's the same thing. I can retire right now, and I'll probably retire about, I think 53, anywhere from 48 to 53 is when I'll retire from the fire department. And so I tell my wife, I'm like, that's going to be a big bill. We've got to adjust, and we got to figure out what's going to take the next step. And just like you go to work and you find another job, and hopefully you have some medical. So what did you end up doing, and where do you work now?
So I'm working at Nissan. I hope you can forgive me for that.
That's all right.
And I'm in the accessories group. So I'm doing a lot of vinyl graphics packages. I'm doing some air induction snorkel, off-road snorkel type stuff. A lot of pickup cargo type things, tailgate adjusters, and that kind of thing. So it seems like it's a really good fit. The projects are short turnaround in comparison to what I'm used to. So like I finished my first project last week, from inception to full scale production. And it was a very compressed time frame, but that's new for me to be on right at the beginning and see it all the way through. So I enjoyed that, but it seems like it's a good fit and, good location for me, and it's keeping the lights on.
Did somebody headhunt you out, or were you kind of like, hey, I'm just going to, retire, and then you're like, nah, I'm ready to go back to work?
I kind of knew, when I retired, there were transition benefits and severance pay and bonuses and all that kind of stuff. So, we laid that out, and I knew I could probably go up to 6 months before I wanted to start working again. And it kind of worked out to be the 3 months. I had posted on LinkedIn and all that kind of stuff. And in all honesty, my resume got a lot of attention, and so I was pleased about that.
Yeah, rightfully so. You've been involved with some amazing projects. How does that work for conflict of interest when you work for GM and then you go to Nissan? There's obviously got to be some things where they're like, you can't talk about that for a few years.
Yeah, my final project, I'm not sure how much I can talk about. But the stuff prior to that, I don't think is an issue. And, there wasn't any kind of non-complete clause or anything like that. So it was fairly liberal.
Good. So when you look back, you had an amazing career. You're still working, still got plenty of gas in the tank or electricity in the volt. What do you look back on? What time? I mean, you talked about being in Arizona. You talked about the fun. What do you look back and think these are the highlights of my GM career? And really, we didn't even really have a chance to talk about your input on the forum, because you could have been on other forums, but the Chevy C10 forum found you, and you were a contributor to that. And I remember, I think your red truck was part of your signature. How we would have our signature up there, because I remember that red truck being on your Keith Seymore signature, essentially.
That's correct, and that's kind of how I found it. Is one of the guys that I knew at Milford knew I was redoing the red truck, and he says, well, you should get hooked up on this particular forum. And that was new for me at the time. And that's kind of how that came about, is I got on there and started, learning things, and really it's the forum where I learned how forums work. And then as a part of that, I thought, well, I'll share my story so these guys at least know where I'm coming from. And so it kind of went from there. I do have a couple of forums that I frequent. There's a Pontiac forum that I'm also on that's very similar as far as the page layout and the way that you can attach or link pictures and that kind of thing. So the two are there's kind of a symbiotic relationship in that regard. They feed off each other.
When you look back, do you have a time where you were just like, this is fond?
Yeah, the years in Arizona are what come to mind there. In hindsight, I wonder if I should have stayed. But I made the decision to kind of follow the career path. The other thing that was going on, as you may recall, there was discussion about closing the proving ground down and moving it to Mexico, and so that was very disruptive, and ultimately didn't happen, and so then they ended up staying there it was probably 10 years after that rumor or after those activities had started. And then now, of course, it's in Yuma. And so there are some guys that still live in Mesa or Queen Creek or Chandler, and they commute to Yuma and work through the week and then come back on the weekends. So that was probably less than ideal.
Yeah, I never did understand why they were going to close it, but that was what the rumor was. It was
a money thing, and it was there was a particular executive that was championing that, and so he was going to be a hero for all the money he saved, and then he ended up retiring, and then it never came to pass. And there was a funny story about that. We had a guy in the dyno lab, so he was a salaried technician, and we'll say his name was Tom Roberts, just for talking purposes.
Tommy
R. It turns out,
good old Tommy.
So as it turns out, there was another guy, a GM executive with that same name, and so this salaried lab technician starts getting these emails about closing the proving ground down and moving it to Mexico and everything. And he showed it to his boss, and he's like, I don't think I'm supposed to be getting these. And so they called the actual guy that was supposed to be getting them, and he said, destroy those. Don't tell anybody anything about that. But that's how we knew it was a go, and that it was a serious program, is that one of the technicians was getting these emails that weren't even supposed to be addressed to him.
Wow. That's great. And the rumor had already made its way around by the time he was told to shut his mouth. I'm sure it didn't take long at lunch and everything else. And then, like you said, 10 years later, the proving ground, stayed, stayed up and running. Yeah. Yeah. That's crazy.
So it was a lot of disruption for no good reason.
A lot of hoopla. So what else? Any other projects that you just absolutely, were such just look back or even the assembly? Anything on the assembly that you look back and laugh, or like, why the hell did we do that? Or just funny stuff.
The whole assembly line experience, like I said, was very necessary, and it was hard. It was so hard at the time. I used to cry before I would go to work. So here's this 17, 18-year-old kid supervising all these hourly guys, and I kind of knew, because my dad was hourly, and so I kind of knew how to mingle and about their sense of humor and, how that was going to be. But it was still very, very hard, but necessary. And I think even as a more mature adult, I took that with me, and I would go into these other assembly plants, whether it was Hamtramck or Mishawaka or wherever, and I would ask the guys to show me around. So if I had some downtime, I didn't have anything going on, I asked our plant host. I'd say, well, show me the paint shop, show me where they put the VINs on, show me whatever. And I wasn't manipulative. I sincerely wanted to know, because I wanted to understand how that worked, or compare it back to what I understood from vintage Pontiac assembly plants or whatever the case may be. But they were always really excited to do that too, that for somebody to take an interest, and so they would take the time, and we'd walk around and look at stuff. So I think that was fun. It was helpful as a enthusiast and a hobbyist, and those were good times. The final project that I worked on, and like I say, I'm not sure how much I can share, but we were in a remote facility. We were off property in the skunk works. We did the design and the build right there in the facility. At that time, I had exterior sheet metal, so I had the entire outside of this particular product, sheet metal, fascias, glass, trim. The trim was actually billet machined out of solid aluminum and then polished and clear coated. That was a great project. It was fun to have that broad responsibility, and across that development cycle.
It sounds like you were challenged. You were personally challenged in that last one.
Yep.
So when will that will come to fruition as obviously a few years from now, possibly?
It's actually out now.
Oh.
You would recognize it if I was able to tell you what it was.
Okay. So I'll just be thinking about that while you're in my audience as well. All right, good. So what do you think, kind of a closing? Again, I so appreciate your time. I hope we can actually check back with you, and it's just such a fun, I think there's so much knowledge that you have, not only about, I'd like to even just say from mentorship to relationships, for you to be able to say, listen, I've been successfully married for this long. I had this job. I was supervising people twice my age. And it's almost too bad a lot of you guys can't write some books and share it from not only management, but culture. And now we've got the millennials and how that changes things. But what about just plain old trucks and how popular these damn C10, CK trucks, the popularity of a Chevy truck, and again, I'm biased, but I'm also right. No truck is more popular than a Chevy C10 CK truck, and the CKs are just getting crazy. I mean, it's a rebirth of everything. What do you think about that? And you were part of that.
I was. I don't know how much credit we can take for that. I think what happened was that was coincident. The rise of the popularity of pickup trucks as personal use vehicles coincides with the downsizing of passenger cars. And so I think as we were going from the big, B cars and Electras and they were getting smaller and front wheel drive and transverse engine, the cars were no longer as capable as what we were used to. And so I think trucks moved in to fill that gap. So if you look at pictures from the 60s and early 70s, it was station wagons. Station wagons were pulling boats. Station wagons were pulling race cars. Station wagons were going on vacation. Station wagons were pulling trailers. And then as cars got smaller, passenger cars got smaller and couldn't really do that work anymore, it was trucks that moved in to fill that gap. That's kind of my perspective on that.
Yeah, but so were Dodge and Ford and these other trucks. So I just think that whether or not GM, we all grew up and we all love them, but they're still the rebirth, and we get to choose. So that's what's cool, is we get to choose which ones we like, and we're biased because we grew up in them, or we always like C10s or whatever. But when you look at it, and I do think that the OBS style of Fords are cool, the OJ Broncos and, the Eddie Bauers, the trucks, that's, whatever. But then the next gen of Fords are just absolutely horrendous. I think that's going to be like your 98, 99. I mean, the paint, everyone I see around here in Arizona, the paint's completely off of it. They're ugly as hell. A couple guys at work still drive them. The 99 Ford, the Super Duties are cool. And I will say right now, Ford is, I hate to say this, Ford is killing it. Lincoln killing it. The new trucks look awesome. I see them coming down the road and I'm like, oh God, those freaking things are awesome. So maybe there's a shift, but what you guys did in the late, in the 80s and in the 90s, all the way up, even the, the Escadinales and everything else, there's some beautiful, beautiful trucks that are still kicking ass today. And then we're not even getting into the LS motor and, how that dominates the world.
Right.
So good run, brother. Good run.
Chevy small block is the standard by which all others are judged.
100%.
And the LS is just the next in that succession.
That's a cherry on the top, and it's the icing and everything else and the parts and in the defense of these other companies, Ford or Dodge or whatever it is, there's just not the aftermarket, So I don't know, good run, and it's a lot of fun to get to know you, some of the inner stories, and to hear you and say, this is, we throw 2 fenders, washers, or 3, or now why it didn't line up the way that we thought, but we had to get them out 1 a minute, 1 a minute.
Yep.
Cool. Well, any last parting thoughts as we take you out from Michigan? For my audience, I'm an AZ and he's 2 hours later than me, and it's a little late, so we're getting ready for President's Day. So again, I appreciate your time, Keith, and it's good to finally get caught up. Nobody have I ever sent more direct messages to on the forum than you in my tenure of the forum, and I'm trying to think when my initial date was. So we've been working on this one for a long time, so it's good to finally get caught up with you.
Yep. Yeah, the only parting comment I can think of is I just wanted to share about our first pickup, which was a 69 GMC step side 2-wheel drive. And the reason that's significant, it was the Hugger orange color, the bright red orange.
Mm-hmm.
And on our street, when I was growing up, the fire chief and the mayor both lived on our street. So that did a couple things for us. Number one, it meant that when it snowed, our street was one of the first ones to get plowed. But the other thing is, the fire chief saw that little red pickup, and he liked it so well that he went ahead and when he ordered the brush truck for the next year, he got a little red GMC step side 4-wheel drive, and that's what they used for their brush truck in the local fire department. So I don't know whatever happened to it. I did stop by the fire department here recently and ask if they had any pictures or anything, that I might be able to see on that. And she said they did, but they were not there because they were in the process of converting them to electronic media, and for me to follow back up. So maybe I'll be able to find out something about the local fire truck that we had.
Well, twofold. I hope you do, and I hope I can find those from you, and I'll badger you a little bit on it. But ironically, a friend of mine, Blake Stoner, he's out of Iowa. I think it's Hudson, Iowa. He just built that same truck, truck for Seymore, 4-wheel drive, step side. I think it was it might have been a 6970. I'm trying to think of the grill real quick. I'm going to send you a ton of pics of it. So he slammed it, put an LS in it, but he had a lot of little things that he would fire back and forth with me because he's kind of looking at like, hey, what color should the bottles be? He did a little gas tank on the side. You open it up. It's got some bourbon glasses and some bourbon. He kept nice. He kept the pump, all the little medallions, all the little things that the owner, so a guy bought it and then had Blake build it. So I will find some pics that I'll get from Blake and or his social media, and then I'll share that with you because it's almost exactly the truck that it actually might be a 69, and I'm trying to think what it said, and it was a 4-wheel drive as well. It was a brush truck, and then it got converted, and it was a really low mile. So ironically enough, those are cool. So good.
Yeah, I'll be interested to see that.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you, Keith, for your time. Thank you for your family, taking you away on a Sunday night and spending it with us, the C10 Nation, C10 Talk. And I hope we can connect again here in the not too long future.
All right. Very good. Thanks for tracking me down.
Thank you.
That's all, folks.